Aaron Brightman here with the Scarlet Faithful podcast, doing a episode on my week at the beach, but obviously some news that came out on Tuesday that I did not want to ignore. Greg Schiano announcing some injury news within the program. Obviously, most important and devastating is the news that Mo Toure has torn his ACL for a second time in 3 years and will miss the entire season. And there's no way to, I think, underestimate or downplay the significance of this. It is a huge blow. In my opinion, as I've said, most of the offseason, Mo Toure, to me, is the most important defensive player for Rutgers, not only for his individual performance, but for what the dynamic that he brings to the defense, his versatility, their ability to give different looks with him on the field, whether they line him up on the edge, whether they have him at the traditional linebacker role, the way he is able to cover ground, sideline to sideline, his also instincts and just ability to have recognition of what's going on the field. He's going to be sorely missed. And while linebacker has some promising depth, I do think that what we've always worried about is the ability for this team to have a special season, their ultimate ceiling. To be able to do that, most likely, you have to have some fortune on the injury front. And to be a week out of the season now, a week and 1 day, and already have, in my opinion, your best defensive player out for the year, there's no getting around the fact that that's a huge blow. And that is not an ideal situation, coupled with the fact that Tyrone Powell and Schiano, I think for the first time, kind of backed off the idea that he would be ready for the season opener. I think that, wisely, they're having patience with him. I think there was optimism going into training camp, and they probably realized he's not. It seems as if he's not as far along as maybe they thought he could be or hoped he would be. But again, he tore his Achilles, had the Achilles injury last January, and that's only coming up on 8 months. So that is, about as quick as you can recover nowadays. I know sometimes they say 6 months, but from a football perspective, I think 8 months is about as early as you could expect. And I think it makes sense to not force him into any situation. So I think that probably means, as I discussed with Larry Kay last week on this podcast, that you're probably looking at a Virginia Tech debut. And I think if so, that's obviously a positive. It wouldn't surprise me if they need to wait even longer than that. So that just beckons the point that now linebacker, which you were expected to have two of the best linebackers in the Big Ten and probably one of the best linebacking cores in the country with that duo. Now you have two spots that are going to be filled by essentially inexperienced players. Now, that's not to say they're not talented players. Obviously, Moses Walker is someone that we're all have high hopes for, former four-star, obviously has the bona fides in terms of his recruiting ranking, his ability. He tore his ACL along with Mo Toure 2 years ago, got into action last year, played every game, started to see flashes as the year went on. And there's been a lot of positive talk about him in this offseason and training camp. And, he really is more of kind of the Mo Toure type of linebacker in terms of physicality, build, all of that. So I think there should be real hope that he can step in and be a very good player. And then also Daryl Djombi obviously played last year as well and is more suited to be like kind of the Tyrone Powell role. So there is depth there, but it's unproven. I think that they're very high on both players. And again, it's a fortuitous opening to the season with Howard and Akron giving this linebacker core an opportunity to really develop and learn from their mistakes in a situation that one mistake probably isn't going to cost you the game, where once we get into the Big Ten play, it could. And that is going to be crucial. So again, Powell should be back at some point. I think it's going to take him time to obviously get the rust out. So the more that Djombi and Walker can excel in this newfound opportunity, you also have Abram Wright behind them. He showed some flashes last year as well. It's, I'm sure in these first two games, you're going to see a lot of all three. They're going to see what works. And they're all going to be able to learn from it. And then you have that bye week to reassess and to process before you go to Blacksburg in that crucial game at Virginia Tech, which is going to be a whiteout now. So this is certainly disappointing, and it's no one's fault. It happens. And just to clarify, and I know Richie O'Leary of the Night Report clarified because people were giving him a hard time. Mo Toure missed the first scrimmage because he had a minor injury. I had mentioned last week he was back at practice. That was true. And then he suffered the torn ACL last week. Shiano announcing on Tuesday. So this was a second injury for Toure during camp, which is all the more frustrating for him. You have to feel for him. Obviously, he has NFL aspirations. And the good news is he, will have a year of eligibility to come back next year if he chooses to. But you just have to, wish him well in terms of his recovery. He's obviously a very, very, very tough kid and player, and led Rutgers in sacks in 20 and 21, was, in my opinion, their best player last year, coming off of that initial ACL injury, and now he's going to have to do it all again. So certainly a huge setback for him, a huge setback for this team. I don't think there's any reason to downplay it. I think there's hope for Djambi and for Walker that they can step up. I think there's hope that Powell will be the player he will be, but I think it might take a few games. So it's for a defense that we all hope is going to be a dominant defense, a top third Big Ten defense, a top 20 national defense. This is now a big question mark. And you have experience on the defensive line, but this is going to add pressure to them. Aaron Lewis is going to need to step up. Obviously, Wesley Bailey. Those guys need to really lead in that defensive front in terms of generating a pass rush without having to rely on the linebackers, specifically Toure, to be able to supplement some of that. So you also have Malcolm Ray, who I'm really high on, Keontae Hamilton. He's given us something at times, and I think his consistency is going to be really important. But I think that starting from 4 is promising. I think the rotation, I'm really high on Jordan Thompson. I think in terms of him taking that next step too. So you have Zaire Angoy. I mean, there's a lot of options there, but they need to develop that cohesive rotation in terms of an 8 deep, I think, minimum of guys they can rely on, and they need to be able to generate a rush that you're not just relying on blitz packages to do so. We know they have a great secondary group, and that secondary group, when Joe Harris-Simiak dialed it up last year with the blitz from the secondary, it worked a lot. But, you can't rely on that as your go-to, of course, and eventually you're going to get burned. So I think staying dominant against the run and being competent against the pass this year, you're going to have to generate that pass rush. So it just puts more pressure on the defensive front. Obviously, you have Longerbeam and Eric Rogers as your corners, and then you have your three safeties in Flip Dixon, Shaquan Loyal, and of course Desmond Igbenusin. All of those guys have heavy reps, and all of their expertise is going to have to be able to lead this defense down. Because the other thing with Powell out, with Toure, your linebackers are the guys that are calling the plays and reading the defenses. That was Powell's role. So that's going to be missing too, just in terms of that experience on the field. Aside from the ability, I think Walker and Djambi obviously have ability, but it's that keeping the defense together now in situations and adversity that other guys are going to have to step up along with them in terms of their performance. So that's going to be a very key thing to watch. I think the other point to point out in terms of Shiano's press conference, which is on my YouTube page if you haven't seen it, is just his overall demeanor. He did seem a little down, and he seemed very up throughout camp. And obviously he's getting into game mode now. We're a week and a day away. It was Tuesday. He spoke to the media. So plus 2 days. But he did hint out and said there's other injuries they're dealing with. Nothing of the season-ending variety. So he said he respectfully did not want to get into it, didn't want to give an opponent a competitive advantage. You could laugh and say, well, why is he worried about Howard? You could say that he's disciplined in doing that. You could also wonder, well, does that mean there's guys that could be out multiple weeks that he doesn't want out there? Obviously, if they don't play, Virginia Tech's going to know that, right? But he doesn't want to get into that. So I think that is the overwhelming concern going into the season, which in a way is a blessing, because if you're worried about injuries and you know that if everybody is there and the development you had with the front, the starters, the two deep, that you believe in that two deep, then that's a real positive, right? Because then that the program has grown from a development perspective, from a talent perspective, from a depth perspective. However, injuries are always a concern. But with Rutgers, with so many seniors, so many experienced starters back, you know that their ceiling is based on all those guys being on the field again. So if they're not, then your ceiling starts to come down potentially, unless the development side of the program takes over and the next man up scenario really blossoms in front of our eyes. And that could happen. Again, last year, no one expected Kyle Monungai to be the back that he became at this point in August before the season started. No one outside the program saw it coming. So that could still happen, of course. It's easy to project. I'm going to have season predictions next week. I still don't know what I'm going to project. It all depends. And the injuries are obviously a big part of that. It has to be. But I think the two-side coin of this is, yes, it's fair to be concerned. It's fair to be disappointed. The ceiling may not be what we thought it was going to be going into the season now. At the same time, it's not an excuse, and it doesn't mean things are falling apart and that this team doesn't have enough really good players to still have a very good year. So I think both can be true. I think both are true. And it's going to be a wait and see in terms of that Howard game, in terms of who is kept out, in terms of what injuries are elsewhere. But obviously, this team needs to stay healthy. And again, I talked about it last week. Having that bye after Akron before Virginia Tech is really great timing for this program, not just from a development standpoint and a preparation standpoint, but also in terms of getting guys healthy that maybe are dealing with stuff right now. So we don't know anything more than that. But if you read body language, if you read demeanor and how they come across, Schiano certainly seemed different on Tuesday than he has previously in training camp. Now, part of that is the grind, right? They had 3 weeks of training camp just ending now. It's been a long dog days this summer, all that stuff, right? And now they're transitioning into game week. There's a lot to do in terms of administratively. He's got a lot on his plate. So you can't blame him for maybe not having the same pep in his step as he did 2 weeks ago. But at the same time, longtime followers of the program and people that have watched and know, and people like me that study Schiano in a way, it did seem like he had some concern to him, especially in knowing the fact that, Toure's injury was not yesterday. He had time to process it. They had time to understand it. They had time to adjust to it. So I don't think it was just that. And he said as much because there are other injuries they're dealing with. So I think this just also belabors the point. I think my last point today is that Ethan Kalik-Manis, not only is his development crucial, but he has to stay healthy because you don't have any real experience behind him. Johnny Shepard's the number 2. He is promising, looked good in the spring game. We know that they're high on him. AJ Serace suffered an injury. He hasn't been a full participant, or he's been limited from everything that's been said and reported. So they are very thin behind Kalik-Manis. So not only does he have to be more accurate and be a leader on the field, he's got to stay on the field. So that offensive line, I think it'll go into play calling, especially early on in the season. I think those first 2 games are going to be pretty vanilla. They're going to rely on the run game even more probably than they'll, because they can't just rely on the run game in Big Ten competition and Virginia Tech. They're going to have to throw the ball. But you're probably going to see them even more conservative on offense those first 2 games now. And just going, one thing I wanted to mention also as I close here is the captains were named as well by Schiano. Mo Toure, Kyle Monungai, and Joe Lusardi named 2-year captains now, captains last year as well. Lusardi on the defense, a model guy for the program, and has done a really good job, special teams as well. So he's a captain once again. Toure obviously out for the year, but he's a captain. That'll keep him engaged. Then Monungai, obvious second-year choice. And then you add Kalik-Manis, no-brainer there. You need your quarterback to be a captain. A lot of talk about how he's integrated himself in the program and with the players. And then Robert Longerbeam at corner makes a lot of sense in terms of captain. And then lastly, Tyreen Powell, at linebacker. So you know that Tyreen Powell, he's going to be so crucial to that defense, but also a leader for this team. And he's going to be back. It's just a matter of when, and it's a matter of how quickly he can acclimate and be back to the Tyreen Powell that is a dominant player. So certainly a lot of health question marks now, a week out from the season. But as I said, as the program's been in many years in the past, there's been a lot more question marks than that. Obviously, QB play, wide receiver room, development-wise, those are question marks, punting, things like that, but they're not as central to everything as staying healthy, which is the biggest key. Because if this team can stay healthy, they're going to be good. And many years before this, you couldn't rely on that. So I think that's a step forward and reason for optimism overall. But yes, we'd be lying to ourselves if we said, hey, there's no reason to be concerned. There is. But at the same time, there's a lot of pieces on this team, and the leadership, the culture, the talent. I think this team is still set up for a very good season. Their top ceiling might be coming down a little bit, depending on what the other injuries are and the timelines there. But I think, the woe is me, giving up, things like that. I saw a little bit of social media overreaction. That's exactly what it is. Overall, good captain choices and a lot to be excited about still. A little bit over a week from the season. You just have to keep chopping. As you see in the video, this T-shirt from Night and Day Apparel. Go to their site, Night and Day Apparel. You can get this shirt, Keep Chopping shirt, or also they have a lot of great merchandise as well as some Scarlet Faithful merch as well. If you type in Scarlet Faithful in the discount code, you get 10% off any apparel you get from Night and Day Apparel. So check them out. And thanks so much for listening and watching. I'll have a preview episode with David Anderson coming out later this week, touching on the ceiling and the floor for this team that we did. And, I may be back for something else. I don't know. I am going to have a whole episode on the AD search replacing Pat Hobbs very soon as well. But like I said, I am at the beach too, so I'm going to enjoy that. And thanks so much for listening and watching once again here at the Scarlet Faithful Podcast.